This is the checklist for helping you study for the agricultural and industrial revolutions in Global Insights. So I'm going to run through some of these topics. If you still have questions over anything off of this checklist, send me a message and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. So first, to help make sense of how this is laid out, the agricultural revolution, if y'all remember, will get its start in the Netherlands by the late 1600s, and then it will shift to England by the early 1700s. So you might want to add here early 1700s so you know when the agricultural revolution takes place in England. So basically you're looking at where and when. For these new methods introduced, that pertains to number 6, crop rotation. That's one of the new farming methods that will help produce more crops. We know the seed drill will help farmers, as well as improvements made with fertilizer. That's going to help the crops grow a lot faster, which means more, in the long run. Remember that for these new methods to be practiced, the land was enclosed. No more common land when those enclosure laws were passed. So when you're studying number 4, don't forget there used to be common land for everybody to share and farm, but that all came to an end with the enclosure laws. People are fencing off their land and practicing these new farming methods like crop rotation. And of course, they got help from Jethro Tull's seed drill. Okay, this number 7, self-explanatory. Y'all can look that up in your notes. For number 8, more food is the same thing as greater crop yields. This was made possible thanks to crop rotation. You no longer have to leave part of your land fallow or unplanted because of the new technique of crop rotation. So that means more food in the long run, which is greater crop yields. That means more is being produced. Y'all can go back in your notes and look over those population increases and what's happening with mortality rates. That should be easy for you to look back with Malvis' essay on population. Urbanization, we did a whole section of your notes on that. Now, when you study the Industrial Revolution, it's kind of like what I did with the agricultural up here for 1 and 2. Study 12 and 13 together. So the Industrial Revolution started in about 1750 in England. You want to include why. Why is it starting in England rather than other places of Europe? And those are those reasons we went over in, I think it was Roman numeral 3. We talked about you've got an abundant source of natural resources. You have an entrepreneurial work ethic. You've got colonial markets for goods. Those things. I think there's 4 total. Y'all go back and look over the cottage industry and how the textiles are being produced in the home until, of course, the machines get too large, and then they have to start building the factories to produce more textiles. But there are some machines we went over that apply to the textile industry, specifically the cottage industry. You've got the spinning jenny, you've got the flying shuttle, you've got the cotton gin. So make sure you go back and look over those inventions and who invented each one. And then remember, in the textile industry, they did have the water frame by Richard Arkwright, but it's too big to be in the cottage industry, so that will be housed in a factory. This part about many leaving the farm, again, that's dealing with those enclosure laws. When those enclosure laws got passed, many people had to sell their land. So they are leaving the countryside and they're moving into the cities, which we said led to urbanization. Y'all know about the factories. We did a whole reading about that and how difficult it was for those workers, common complaints that they had. Let's see, of course, how it changes the family. families do work together in the factories, just like they do in the cottage industry. But the biggest difference is you don't have that quality time that you get to spend with your family members in a factory because it's very strict hours. And the smallest mistake could mean you don't have, money to feed your family. We talked about the reasons for child labor. It meant some families being able to have food. Everybody needed to work for those poor families. And then we have people who are going to, of course, push Parliament to put an end to child labor. So, we talked about early child labor laws, the Factory Act, and then later, and here they are down here on 36, the Factory Act, 10 Hours Act, Mines Act, all of these pertain to reducing the number of hours that children are working, or with the Mine Act, completely prohibit children from those underground mines. So you could probably make the connection on 36 with 19 when you're studying child labor. Number 20, for many years, workers were not allowed to go on strike or join a labor union. Those were illegal activities. But I want you to add until 1824, because by 1824, these actions became legal. These are some city features on 21, so that's self-explanatory. Same thing on 22, so 21 and 22 should be studied together with urbanization and how bad the cities were becoming during the Industrial Revolution. If you see the term bobbies on your test, this refers to the police in London, England. This is actually the name of the police in London, England. They're called bobbies. 24 are your examples of transportation methods, the improvements of transportation during the Industrial Revolution. So they're going to build railroads, steamboats, macadam roads. So make sure you go back and look over that information in your notes. David Ricardo, if you remember, he is someone who was against government getting involved to help people who are the working poor. For example, his Iron Law of Wages, you can go back and look that up about he wants people paid the bare minimum, just enough to survive. He would be a believer of 26, economic liberalism. So if you believe in economic liberalism, you are liberal-minded to believe you don't want the government as involved in the economy. So it's basically laissez-faire is a part of economic liberalism, that hands-off approach to the economy, not wanting the government to be heavily involved. So other than Ricardo, you would need to know Thomas Malthus. He's an example of who believes in economic liberalism. And for spelling, he's up here on number 10. Someone else who believed in economic liberalism would, of course, be Adam Smith, the father of capitalism. Speaking of capitalism, to look over that information. We went over Adam Smith in your notes and some of those characteristics of capitalism. There is a rising economic gap during the Industrial Revolution. That means, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. And so, there's this large gap in between those groups. However, I need you to add next to this word on 29, thanks to reforms made, the gap started to shrink. So it got smaller thanks to reforms being made. And we know Parliament played a role in that in England. For 30, the standard of living, we know at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, it's fair to say that people's standard of living was terrible. You just look at the city and how bad the cities were getting, and you can give some details there. But I want you to know that it's going to change. As the Industrial Revolution gets into the 1800s, reforms are made to improve the standard of living. So make sure, again, that the standard of living will improve thanks to reforms, by the 1800s. 31, you can tell that these are not in the proper order for industrializing. We know, of course, England is first. And then if I ask y'all after England, what comes next? It's Belgium is second. Third is France. Germany or the German states is fourth. When the Great Exhibition took place in London, don't forget Queen Victoria was ruling England at that time. So she was a big supporter of this, version of a World's Fair. Y'all can go back and look over the Luddites and why they were so angry, as these farm workers. Those two go together, 33 and 34. Y'all can look up Charles Dickens and Hard Times. That's in one of those sections we recently went over. We just talked about 36 with child labor, as well as, women being reduced to working here. Criticism of capitalism. So we know that not everybody was satisfied with capitalism, and that's part of the reason people turned to socialism for a new economic system. So critics of capitalism would be socialists, Marxists, like Karl Marx and his followers. You could even say some of the factory workers, workers in general were complaining about capitalism and how they were being taken advantage of by owners of businesses. When you study socialism, you have a whole section. So that just means go back and look over the highlighted material in your outline on socialism and pay attention when you're studying socialism for 39. Look up what the utopian socialist, what they believe government should own versus Marxist, what they think government should own. Again, there was a part of our notes that we went over this. Y'all know Elizabeth Gaskell wrote Mary Barton, the book that will convince the middle class to finally push for legislation to help the poor, because she described how terrible the poor's living conditions were, and it finally opened up the eyes of those middle class, and they will take action. Equal distribution of profits on 42. This is a goal of socialists. So socialists believed this. They want all money to be equally distributed. And a good example, if I ask you, who believed this? John Stuart Mill. He was a socialist that believed that. Which, of course, if you remember, we also talked about the utopian socialists. So go back and look over what they believed. Here are some examples. Owen, Fourier, Saint-Simon. So again, look over your highlighted material on all three of those. Remember, Owen had the textile mills in New Lanark and New Harmony. Fourier's the one that created the phalansteries that took two people from each personality trait. Saint-Simon is the one who believed in 46 that scientific managers or technocrats, people who are experts, should run the industries. Look over in your socialism section how they believed in women's rights, free love. Okay, so look back over that. Basically you should be able to practice any kind of religious beliefs. Karl Marx, to look over your specific information on him that we highlighted and how he was pushing for revolution and violence to make changes. He talked about the proletariat being the workers and the bourgeoisie being the factory owners in his pamphlet, Communist Manifesto. So connect 50 to 53 when you study those. When you study 51, which is Marxism, communism is, Marxism. Make sure you know it targets the industrial worker and not, and here's how you finish this, the factory owners, which are your bourgeoisie. So again, communism targets the industrial worker and not the factory owners, and you can put in parentheses bourgeoisie, because that's where the factory owners are coming from, the middle class. Famous last line of the pamphlet Communist Manifesto is "Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." Remember, he co-wrote this with Engels. So go back, of course, and look over anything that y'all added. I gave y'all the PowerPoint to copy that off of, and I talked a little bit about those. But if there's anything study material that you have questions about, please send me a message. If you know you're going to be back in class, you can always ask the first couple of minutes at the beginning of class. But those of you that are not in class, Again, send me messages if you are unsure about any of this material.